Good afternoon. I'm Barbara Snyder, president of Case Western Reserve University, and we are very pleased to welcome you this afternoon to our campus. It is a little warm in here, so for those of you who are from out of town, perhaps I should disclose in all honesty, it isn't always exactly like this in March in Cleveland. But we are lucky to have it today and working on getting some cooler air in here. A key aspect of our mission as a university is to imagine and influence the future. We do this through research and teaching, writing and mentoring. We cover medicine and management, social work and nursing, engineering and law, and a number of other disciplines. All that said, it is difficult to think of a more profound way to touch the future than to start with the youngest among us. As today's speaker has powerfully illustrated in his research, it is also difficult to identify any approach with greater impact. Today, we have an opportunity to learn from one of the world's great leaders in this field. It is worth noting, however, that we in Greater Cleveland have sought to apply James Heckman's research for years. Our community understands the vital importance of early childhood interventions. Indeed, our county's Invest in Children program highlights our commitment to providing services and support to young children and their families. At Case Western Reserve, faculty across the university engage in research designed to improve the lives of young people today and to inform policy decisions going forward. Let me mention just a few. Dr. James Lalamandir of our School of Dental Medicine has created a sealant program that provides critical dental services to all school children in the Cleveland Metropolitan School District. At the same time, his initiative provides invaluable experience for our dental students. Dr. Elizabeth Short of the Department of Psychology and Dr. Robert Finling of the Department of Psychiatry each bring extensive knowledge, compassion, and expertise to the work of improving children's mental health. And Dr. Claudia Colton and Dr. Rob Fisher in the Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences provide rigorous analysis of existing conditions and propose solutions to the tragedy of neighborhood poverty and its impact on children. These are just a few of the many members of our faculty whose research and teaching focus squarely on children and young people. The list of Schubert Center faculty associates is in your program, and it highlights some of our faculty leaders in this area. And speaking of leaders, it is my great pleasure to introduce an individual who demonstrates every day just what it means to inspire, listen, and learn from faculty, staff, students, alumni, and the community. Dr. Cyrus Taylor is a passionate believer in the mission of the university. He understands the steps necessary to transform those beliefs into reality. We are so fortunate to have him as Dean of our College of Arts and Sciences, the home of the Schubert Center that is sponsoring today's events. And it is wonderful to be able to introduce him to you this afternoon. Dr. Taylor.
As Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, it's my great pleasure to be able to welcome you today. The College of Arts and Sciences, as President Snyder noted, is pleased to be the home of the Schubert Center for Child Studies. The Schubert Center brings together faculty from across our campus to build and enhance connections among research, practice, and policy related to children and childhood at our university and within the larger community. The Schubert Center develops and promotes educational opportunities across disciplines through both classroom and experiential learning opportunities for both undergraduate and graduate students. And the Schubert Center addresses children and childhood from infancy through adolescence and in local, national, and international and global contexts. The College of Arts and Sciences is committed to playing a role in the well-being of children and families in our local and larger communities. And it's in light of this commitment that I'm particularly pleased as Dean to welcome Nobel laureate Dr. James Heckman. His work brings our attention to the evidence for investing in young children, developing the skills that they need, and then sustaining this investment through to adulthood. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Heckman, our community partners, and all of you in the audience to today's program. And now it's my pleasure to turn over the podium to Dr. Jill Corbin, who I get to work closely with as Associate Dean. She's also a professor of anthropology, and I think we owe a particular debt to her in her role as director of the Schubert Center for Child Studies. So, Jill.
I have the wonderful task of being able to thank very many people. First, I'd like to thank, of course, President Snyder and Dean Taylor for their support for the Schubert Center and its work to bridge research, practice, and policy on behalf of child well-being, and their dedication to issues of children and childhood on campus can't be overstated, and so the Schubert Center thanks them very much. Today represents, too, a blending of the university and our community partners who've been very active in helping to make this and other events happen. And so I'd like to, in particular, thank our three community partners that are on the back of your program: Amy Swanson from Voices for Ohio's Children, Rebecca Dorman from Invest in Children, and Katie Kelly from Groundwork, who are all here today, and I won't make them stand up. Okay. Also, of course, the Schubert Center would not be what it is without the very talented and dedicated faculty at our university who do research on children and childhood and seek to promote and provide the best possible knowledge about children. And many of these faculty are, as both President Snyder and Dr. Dean Taylor said, listed in your program as Schubert Center faculty associates. Nothing ever happens by magic either, and so I'd like to thank the Schubert Center. We work together well. We find this very engaging work around these issues of children and childhood. So I'd like to acknowledge those of us at the Schubert Center, Associate Director Elizabeth Short, who is also in the Department of Psychology, the Director of our Child Policy Initiative, Gabriella Celeste, Jessica McRitchie, who is sitting in the back, who makes everything happen. Everything that runs smoothly today is because of Jessica. And also our hardworking graduate students and undergraduate students. There are a number of our students from anthropology today who've been helping. So the work of the Schubert Center is to expand our capacity to bridge research, practice, and policy, and to educate our students from undergraduate years, not waiting till they're graduate students, but from their undergraduate years in child policy issues. And this has been made possible with the support of our own university, the president and the dean, as I mentioned, but it would also not have been possible without the support of foundations and donors who've believed in us and who have helped us really at every stage of this work. So this event then really belongs to them and is as well and is a credit to them. So I'd like to say that we've had support from the Cleveland Foundation and thank them very much, the Schuberts for whom this center is named, and also importantly, Marcia Egbert and Dave Abbott from the George Gunn Foundation have helped us really every step in the way and believe that universities and the policy world could really come together to for a fruitful collaboration. So they've provided us with much support and perhaps even more importantly, a lot of encouragement. So we thank them very much. Now, finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Alicia Leatherman, who's going to introduce our speaker today. We're very pleased to have her with today. She was appointed by Governor Strickland to serve as the director of the Early Childhood Cabinet. This is a very important body that's composed of directors of the important agencies responsible for child and family well-being and has the mission to unite all of us and unite these key state agencies around the common goal of promoting early childhood development and education by setting and coordinating state policy and programs which serve Ohio's children from prenatal time to 6. In this role, Ms. Leatherman has had the responsibility for coordinating and overseeing and being the driver in so many ways in front of and also behind the scenes, very importantly, the development of Ohio's early education system. She's also served in numerous agencies working for the well-being of children, including being the director of the Ohio Child Care Research and Referral Association. All of these accomplishments and activities are based in what many of this room know, that Alicia Leatherman has been a tremendous and powerful voice on early childhood in our state of Ohio and has had an impact beyond that. She's worked tirelessly on behalf of Ohio's children, has helped all of us do our work, and is the perfect person to introduce our speaker today on behalf of the governor. So thank you very much, Alicia, for joining us.
On behalf of the Strickland administration, I would like to extend my thanks to Case Western Reserve University and the Schubert Center for Child Studies and their partners for hosting this presentation today with Dr. Heckman. We can all point to moments in history when an event, legislation, or a body of research changed the future of a system, social movement, or policy agenda. In the early childhood arena, some of these moments include the creation of Head Start, the passage of Child Care Development Block Grant and other federal streams of funding, the release of early brain research, and I would definitely put Dr. Heckman's work on that list. He has transformed and shifted the way that our country's policy leaders view the importance of investing in early childhood. He has inspired a generation of philanthropists, legislators, and governmental and business leaders to examine the societal benefits for investing in early childhood systems and programs, but not solely as a moral obligation, but as a legitimate economic development strategy. In fact, his groundbreaking work has been used throughout our work here in Ohio. As the campaign's first platform, developed by then-candidate Ted Strickland, the early childhood agenda included the following, quote, "A growing number of economists, including Nobel laureate James Heckman, note that investment in high-quality early care and education outperforms other economic development strategies. There is no debate that additional resources are needed for early childhood services, which is one of Dr. Heckman's main messages. In fact, it is the evidence and work of Dr. Heckman that provided us with the justification to invest $170 million per year in new state general revenue dollars. While these funds cannot fill the hole that one-time federal funds left in our system, we believe we have a more sustainable base from which to build. An additional lesson that we've learned from Dr. Heckman is that reaching families early is better, and that the quality of service we design and provide matters greatly to the return on investment we can expect. We are committed to increasing the quality of our services throughout our early childhood system, from home visiting and early intervention work to our quality rating and improvement system. When developing our guidance document for Step Up to Quality, which is our quality rating and improvement system, we again went back to Dr. Heckman's work. Learning starts in infancy, he said, long before formal education begins, and continues throughout life. Recent research demonstrates how vitally important the early preschool years are for skill formation. Early learning begets later learning, and early success breeds later success, just as early failure breeds later failure. And imagine, Ohio is only one state who is utilizing Dr. Heckman's incredible research and expertise to elevate early childhood as a policy and funding priority. Now, a bit about Dr. Heckman's current work and accomplishments. He is the Henry Schultz Distinguished Service Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago, where he has served since 1973. And he directs the Economics Research Center and the Center for Social Program Evaluation at the Harris School for Public Policy. In addition, he is a professor of science and society in University College Dublin and a senior research fellow at the American Bar Foundation. Dr. Heckman is actively researching the economics of human development and building theoretical and empirical models of human capacity formation. This work will emphasize the role of the family in producing capacities and the effects of capacities on education, wages, health, crime, and other dimensions of lifetime achievement. He is currently conducting new social experiments on early childhood interventions and reanalyzing old experiments. Dr. Heckman has published over 260 articles and several books. Dr. Heckman has received numerous awards for his work, including the Distinguished Contributions to Public Policy for Children Award from the Society for Research in Child Development in 2009. It is truly a privilege to have an opportunity to introduce someone that I consider to be an incredible champion for young children, whose interest in early childhood elevated its importance to those of us in the human service world, which felt like overnight. Dr. Heckman.
Thank you very much. You gave a lot of my talk, so I can make it short. I'm very glad to be here. I appreciate the kind words and the forum and the turnout on a beautiful day like this. It's such a rarity in Cleveland. You should be outside, not inside, but I'm glad you're inside. So I do thank President Snyder, Dean Taylor, and of course Jill Corbin, who invited me here, and Alicia Leatherman for very kind words, and I hope I can live up to your expectations. And I do want to talk about this question about, oops, I already started my talk without knowing it. I do want to talk about the economic case for investing in early childhood education. But let me talk a little bit before I get into the main talk, just about why I'm here and what I'm doing. So I'm going to talk about this, but I am an economist. You have to understand that. And therefore, I am primarily interested in questions to do with the economy in terms of productivity and aspects of things involving income and equality. However, in understanding economics, I'm a firm believer that it's important to understand more broadly. I mean, there was once a line, I think it was by Keynes, actually, and the argument was something like, that person who is only economist is not a very good economist. Namely, when we deal with the economy, we have to understand many of the sources of what we're dealing with. And here, we're dealing with the formation of human capital. And so I really want to try to understand not just what economics has to say, but how economics has been and is being enriched by drawing on studies from a number of fields, including psychology, which you'll hear much about today, as well as from work in epidemiology and work in developmental biology, which I think is highly relevant. And this work actually causes us to rethink very much the way we conceive skilled policy. And I want to try to just acquaint you with the rudiments of the argument, and then hopefully there'll be some time for questions and discussion. So let me make a few observations that I think are very important to lay out on the table. Anybody who studied the American economy in the last 30 years knows that American society is becoming polarized and less productive. What do I mean by that? Well, if we look at measures of income inequality, we find that, in fact, the population income distribution has been widening. It's been a phenomenon going on for 30 years, not just in the United States, but certainly in the United States. It's also the case that our productivity is declining. So if we think about international competition, economists think about something called total factor productivity growth or average labor productivity. There are different concepts trying to capture this notion of productivity. We've seen a real decline in the last 20 years, and that translates into a slowdown in the rate of growth of wages and also contributes to inequality because it's not uniform across different groups. So the question becomes, what do we know? Well, American society is more polarized. And we've also seen as another dimension that a greater percentage of children are going to college than ever before in the history of American society. And at the same time, a greater percentage is dropping out of high school, if you properly measure the high school graduation rate. So what we've seen is an emergence of two societies, where some part of the society is doing very well, sort of two Americas, if you will, and the other America is this case where we're talking about individuals who are really dropping out in a fundamental way, not getting the wages even of a high school graduate. And those wages haven't really been so good anyway in terms of keeping pace. So the middle class is starting to disappear. And we have levels of inequality that are starting to reach those that are witnessed in Latin American countries, where we think income is very highly unequally distributed. Just one measure of how bad things are getting at the bottom end, for example, a recent study of military recruits in the U.S. Army suggested that about 75% of everybody, all the youth who apply, men and women, are deemed ineligible. Now, this isn't the whole American population, but it's 75% of the young people who apply are screened out because of three criteria: criminal records, low levels of cognitive capacity. Students, or these applicants, take a test called the Armed Forces Qualifying Test, or because of obesity. They're simply so morbidly obese, they really can't perform in the Army. This is a suggestion that a society, and it's consistent with some of the other statistics about the lower end of the distribution of income, the lower distribution of skills actually increasing in American society. When we look at measures of workforce literacy, we find about 20% of the whole workforce in the American population is illiterate in the sense that it really can't understand medical instructions, simple medical instructions. I'm not talking about reading a medical book. I'm talking about reading instructions. Don't take a pill more than once a day. And what we've seen then, and this is a phenomenon that's translated directly into economic performance, is we have a slowdown in the growth of skills, and it's reducing our competitiveness in the world economy. We're still a competitive economy. We're still doing very well. But on the other hand, it is the case that our rate of growth of productivity has really slowed down. Now, the reason why I'm here and the kind of case I'm trying to assemble is one that asks you to go beyond the usual descriptions of the problem and the usual solutions for it. So, for example, most public policy discussions, maybe not in Ohio. I'm encouraged to hear the discussion that was said by Ms. Leatherman. But most public policy forums discuss these issues one at a time. They typically are worried about the fact that the high schools may be failing, or tuition costs are high, or some other, one family or another, a family may be failing, or something of the sort. But there isn't an integrated approach to understanding these problems. And so as a result, we have a lot of different competing proposals. People recognize these problems, although some of these facts, like the increasing high school graduation dropout rate, may not be completely familiar. But nonetheless, there is a perception that something is not going well in American society, and the question is, how can we proceed to address these problems? And so what's happened is that there's been an array of different proposals, and they lack coherence. There's a sense in which there isn't an integrated principle based on science, social science, that really allows us to address these questions. So I'm going to try to present my vision of how to approach these problems. So I want to try to articulate an approach that's coherent. It's not complete. It's coherent in the sense of laying out a vision, but there are many gaps. Like any kind of study of inquiry here at a major university, we know that we're always provisional in anything we say. But I do want to try to lay out the framework, which I think will be filled in successfully, and to show that there's a strong economic case for investing in young children. So let me summarize the argument and give you a few facts to sort of display this. I don't know what your forum is. I'm happy to take questions in the middle, but I'm also happy to wait to the end. I don't know, it's probably better to wait till the end. I really prefer the other way, but at the University of Chicago, we frequently interrupt, so I actually I don't call it interruption, it's clarification. The greatest danger of any speaker is to be talking and maybe saying absolutely nothing and leaving everybody bored. So I can get a feedback, it's great. But anyway, so what I want to give is a few key points, and then amplify these points as time permits. The first point is that we know we encounter many social problems. I haven't mentioned crime yet, but the estimates are somewhere between annual cost of crime to the U.S. economy is somewhere over $1 trillion. It can be as high as $1.3 trillion, been estimated. But if we think about an array of social problems like crime, teenage pregnancy, obesity, high school dropout rates, this widening income inequality, low level of skill, and even adverse health conditions beyond obesity, I want to argue can be traced in part, I emphasize in part, to low levels of skill and ability in society. So we've come to understand the importance of ability, but we've come to understand it in a fundamentally different way than we thought about it in the past. And this is an important part of my talk. I want to talk about ability. I want to talk not just about ability in the sense of an IQ test or some test of how you do on an exam, but I want to think about multiple abilities, because when we think about ability, we have to think very long and very hard about how we can, what ability really is and what abilities are that make for success. And then, of course, what can we do about shaping this ability? I would argue that inequality in ability is a major contributor to inequality in society and to some of our slowdown in society. So It is the case, if we look at most public policy discussions. I don't want to say all public policy discussions, because I think there's a growing awareness. But a lot of discussions focus on measures of school productivity, for example. For example, the No Child Left Behind Act that was put out by President Bush and is now being reformed by President Obama still is focusing largely on measures of cognitive ability. Sometimes IQ receives a lot of attention. There's a whole literature that starts with IQ and the wealth of nations, showing that countries with high IQs do well and countries where the people have low IQs do poorly. So there's kind of an IQ culture or an achievement test culture. They're not the same. IQ and achievement are definitely not the same. But nonetheless, there is a focus. So No Child Left Behind really is focusing on an achievement test, not an IQ test. And it's not fully capturing all the dimensions of social and economic success, one things that produce social and economic success. So I'm not going to deny that cognitive abilities are important, but what we've come to understand, and it's really important for public policy discussion, is that these so-called soft skills, that these socio-emotional abilities, as well as early health conditions, things to do with perseverance, attention, motivation, and self-confidence, play very powerful roles. And the reason why I emphasize this is that this is frequently neglected in public policy discussions. I had a meeting a few months ago with the mayor of New York, Bloomberg, who is now in his third term and is trying to consider a new agenda. And he was very surprised that there was any evidence about soft skills. I think a lot of people are surprised that the idea that somehow these touchy-feely things like, being able to adhere, we have all these quotations we teach our kids, we teach ourselves actually, things like, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. That's attributed variously to Edison, to Einstein, and various other major minds. But we've all known that in our culture, and yet we thought we can't measure that, it's not important, and it's somehow in the background. And yet what's happened is that we've come to measure these traits in a way that we didn't have before. Measurement systems we didn't have. And we've come to understand they're important, and we come to understand they contribute greatly to the performance of society at large. And what we've also come to understand is that some of these achievement test scores that we focus so much attention on are actually partly determined by how motivated children are to take the test. So you can take kids who have of a certain background, and you can basically have incentivize them, give them some incentive to do well on a test, and they can do extremely well on a test if you incentivize them. It turns out that about half of the variance in a lot of these standard achievement tests that we use to measure success in schools are predicted by how motivated, how perseverant, personality traits of the children, not necessarily just raw IQ or even fundamental knowledge. You have to want to answer the question on a test to really do well on the test. So what I would argue is that we have to rethink our view. So abilities are multiple and they're more than cognition. That's one point. But secondly, we need to understand that ability is not something that's fixed at birth. There's a lot of discussion out there where we think ability, for example, IQ, may be heritable. There's a lot of discussion about heritability. We know there are genetic components to everything, virtually everything in human performance. Yet, we've also come to understand that ability can be shaped. And it's more than just a pure matter of genetics. It's more than just a pure matter of saying what your father or mother's genes were, how they combined. So we've understood that we can change ability, and that ability then is another avenue by which human social policy can affect human development. What we've also come to understand through a series of very important studies by psychologists, by people in schools of education, economists, sociologists, demographers, is that these ability gaps that are so predictive of who goes to college, who doesn't go to college, these gaps are essentially opening up at very early ages. So for example, I'll show you a few slides along these lines, but basically before schooling begins, much of the gap between the haves and the have-nots, those who are highly successful, those who are likely to go to college, those who are not, many of those gaps have already opened up by age 4 or 5, long before kids are going to school. And understanding that means that we have to think back, if we're going to, since ability is important, that those ability gaps, if they're going to be addressed, are going to have to be addressed earlier on, simply because Even though we know the schools are important for communicating knowledge, a lot of the gaps in abilities are neither significantly added to or subtracted from by the schools. So there is a substantial difference in the way we think about what schools can do and how we achieve performance in life. So what we've come to understand, and this is where the family policy issue is so important, and it's a delicate issue, as I'll try to discuss. We know that the family environments of young children are major predictors, but we also know that it's not just heritability. It's the sense that we do know how some families with practices of parenting, enriching the environments of children, can actually shape those abilities. Those abilities actually become a subject, a target for public policy intervention in a way that we didn't think possible 20 or 30 years ago. There was a book written, maybe published 15, 16 years ago by Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein called The Bell Curve. Maybe some of you have read the book or know about the book. The book essentially argued that IQ, ability, was very important, and it explained a lot of the gaps and a lot of performance in society. And part of the empirical exercise in the book is in fact very valid. It is an important predictor, ability. But what it also came up with was the notion that somehow these abilities were genetically determined, that we really were doing studies of heritability, that genes created this, and that in some real sense, social policy should recognize that some people were born inferior, some people were born superior, and that maybe in the last chapter of that book, they actually have a section where they suggest that for the dumb, we should have something like reservations. They really can't fit into the modern society. We should just put them away in these reservations for the idiots. What we've come to understand is that that view, that last chapter's view especially, is completely wrong, that we can shape these abilities. And I want to show you a little bit of evidence on that question. But because we know that families play an important role, we also know that family environments should be looked at more carefully than they are. And the structure of the family, which is something we frequently neglect in our economic and social policy, has to come back more into public policy attention. So a lot of the case for understanding about where society may have gone wrong or how we can do better is a way that we can think about supplementing and aiding the resources available to families. And it's an undeniable fact. If you look at the statistics, I'll show you some, but the structure of the argument is really that we have seen a tremendous change in family environments in the last 40 years. It was very rare phenomena 40 years ago that many children were born out of wedlock. Always some, there were always kids born out of wedlock. But now we're reaching a state where up to 15 to 16% of all American children are born into families where the child never sees the father. There's some close to 30% of all children are living in single-parent homes. And although it's not invariable, it's typical that most of these environments, at least in the United States, are environments where the child is with a mother who's typically less educated. The resources available to the family and to the child in the family are considerably reduced, truncated, and this leads to substantial developmental problems down the line. So this policy and the origins of these problems, I think, are partly the origins of problems in the family, and the solutions to these problems then arise from our understanding how we can address the problems of the family, supplement the family. So experiments have been performed, and I'll talk a little bit about this. And the experiments that have been performed are essentially experiments that show that when we supplement the lives, on a voluntary basis, we supplement the lives of disadvantaged children, and we give them essentially some of the parenting resources that they typically don't receive, we can see substantial economic and social benefits from those interventions. And we've learned that if society intervenes early enough in the life cycle of a child, it can raise both the cognitive and the social-emotional abilities and the health of disadvantaged children. So what we've come to understand is that these early interventions reduce inequality. They promote schooling, they reduce crime, reduce teenage pregnancy, and by creating these abilities that translate into productivity, that make workers more productive, they simultaneously increase workforce productivity. And so if you do a strict benefit cost analysis, you simply ask, well, how much is it You know, for example, if you compare how costly, what's the rate of return to investing in, say, reducing classroom sizes, which receives a lot of attention in public policy discussion. We compare the rate of return on that with investments in early childhood, supplementing the resources of these families. We can see a huge difference. In fact, the rate of return for reducing classroom size has been estimated to be negative. It's cheaper, actually, to give the money to the kids directly in a bond than to reduce classroom size. It's not that reducing classroom size doesn't change student performance. It's just that it costs you money to do that. You have to hire teachers, you have to change the facilities to do so. If you do the same kind of hard-nosed cost-benefit analysis on early childhood, you actually will find that it has a very high rate of return. In fact, a rate of return that's higher than the rate of return on equity in the stock market over the post-war period, say 1945 to 2008. So these interventions have a very high rate of return. It's unfortunate that in our discussions about these matters, public policy has kind of drifted away from looking at what economists used to do, which was looking at rate of return analysis and benefit cost analysis, asking, does this project really pay for itself? Well, when you do that kind of accounting, you see that these programs have a very high rates of return, certainly compared to the alternative programs, like many of the programs that we saw put out in the place last year in terms of the AARA, the Recovery Act. We can actually see, like, fixing potholes has a very low rate of return, it turns out, a couple of % a year, much lower than the Perry project, which I'll talk about, an early childhood program of 6 to 10% a year. Reducing pupil-teacher ratios, job training programs. There's been a typical pattern found that if we intermediate, we try to remediate later in the life of a child and sort of fix the problem after it's occurred. So we get a kid who's dropped out of school and try to fix that kid by sending the kid to a job training program. Or we look at a prisoner and we try to rehabilitate the prisoner. That with our current knowledge, with our current capacity to remediate, that the rates of return on those programs are typically very low. So that's the kind of comparison that has to be made in public policy. I'm sure that many people are saying, well, you know, times are tough in Ohio, times are tough everywhere. But in spending dollars, there's still a case for a limited budget to spend it in the most effective way. And the evidence really strongly supports the analysis of early childhood interventions. So what I want to argue, as has already been said by Ms. Leatherman, but the skill formation is dynamic in nature. This notion that we understand then, so all this is highly intuitive. There's a lot of this material totally intuitive. But what's new about the argument is that it's been formalized, there's a lot more evidence, and we have a lot more specifics about how to deal with specific problems. So we know that the longer we wait to intervene in the life cycle of a disadvantaged child, the more costly it is, and that's something very important. So we need to understand these dynamics of human growth, and as we do that, we will reformulate the way we think about our health policy, we will reformulate the way we think about our education policy, we will reformulate the way we think about remediation versus prevention. This is going to be the key in the next 20 years. So if we can ever get off the topic of immediately worrying about how we're going to stay alive in the next few months, and we think about how we're going to fix fiscal deficits, how we're going to change the productivity of the economy, how we're going to try to really adapt to what seems to be a fundamental problem with health care, with deficits of all sorts. Well, we'll have to understand that refocus towards the early years is going to be far more effective and far more cost effective, and that this refocus will actually change the way we think about public policy. So let me show you a little bit of the evidence, although that's really my argument, so I could stop right now if you want. I don't know if you want to see evidence. There's a danger. See, that's the evidence, and that's stated somewhat in a general way, and now I can get very specific, and I can make things very, very technical, and I won't, but I will just try to give you a little bit of these themes, just try to flash through a few of these slides to show you the importance. So first of all, let me try to give you what some of the evidence is on cognitive and non-cognitive skills. And let me show you some findings that I think are extremely important. Now, I mentioned in the beginning of the talk that there was this whole issue about the structure of the high school dropout rate was actually increasing. Now, many people are very surprised to hear that. And now, why is that true? Well, the reason is that about 12% of all of our high school graduates each year are produced by GED programs, 12 to 14%. It varies across states. I don't know if you know about the GED program. It's a second chance program given to dropouts. They take this test and they certify that they're the equivalents of high school graduates. So 12% of all high school students produced each year, certified, and counted actually in the current population survey, and counted in a lot of statistics, are these GEDs. And the GED test is good. So if we look, for example, at this is the distribution for males and females, the left being for males, the right for females, of the test score. This is just the percentage of people at different points of the distribution, going from the bottom of the distribution to the top, males and females. Now you ask, how well do the GEDs do? Well, in the overall distribution, the GED test scores are pretty much the same as the high school graduate test scores. And if we look at the way that we usually judge American policy, we would say, okay, the GED is a success. And many people think it is, by the way. Again, the very same mayor of New York, big discussions about how to improve, if anything, expand access to GED programs. And yet, what we've come to understand when you look at these very same GEDs, that the GEDs are as a group, earning basically at the rate of high school dropouts. They're as smart as ordinary high school graduates, as you just saw, but they lack non-cognitive skills. And those non-cognitive skills are exactly why they're learning. The very reasons that cause them not to be able to finish school also causes them not to be able to finish the military, not to be able to do a number of other tasks. So, for example, if we think of who these GEDs are, these are the wise guys who can't finish anything. And in fact, the Army and Navy and the Marines won't accept them. The Marines, interestingly enough, won't accept the GEDs because they're too violent, too undisciplined. It's not a, you want violence to be controlled violence, not the kind of undisciplined violence. And this, I think, is very revealing. And this is just like one of many pieces. We've done a large number of studies. Let me just show you. So a lot of work by psychologists back in the 80s, Herrnstein in particular and other colleagues of his, showed that if you looked at crime, the crime was related to IQ, some measure of ability. And so without getting into the details of how this is produced, what you can see is if you take somebody who's the very bottom of the distribution and you move that person to the top, or I should say more precisely, if you look at people at the bottom of the distribution and you look at people at the top of the ability distribution, the probability that they will have been in jail by age 30 or other measures of incarceration, you get a similar pattern. There's a real drop-off. So in this sense, ability, and this is actually a causal relationship, although I won't get into the details of how that's established. But if we look at non-cognitive measures too, measures of self-control, management, anger, and so forth, we see a substantial difference that appears in the structure of the, that again, as we go down from the very bottom, people who lack these non-cognitive traits, and as we accelerate from the bottom to the, say, fifth, just to the beginning of the second decile of, no, I guess the 21st through 40th percentiles, that what you see is a real falling off, so that basically these non-cognitive skills are very predictive. And this is true of a number of other traits. If you look at teenage pregnancy, these traits are also equally predictive, and you go from the bottom to the top. Cognitive skills are highly predictive. Most of you in the room are college graduates, sort of people who are high on the end of the cognitive distribution, and non-cognitive distribution are almost certain to go to college and almost certain to graduate four-year colleges. As we go down the ability distribution, we find substantial differences. So here is the example. These are the marginal distributions. If you put the two together, they strongly interact. So if you look, for example, at this score, you go for people at the very bottom of the cognitive distribution, they're almost very unlikely to graduate four-year colleges. Same thing true about people lacking these non-cognitive, these socio-emotional skills. As you move to the top, you get to very high levels of probability. And these are like marginals, and if you put them together, they interact, and it's virtually one if you're at the high end that you're going to graduate four-year college. So there's a lot of other smoking behaviors. I don't want to beat you to death. If you look at log wages, you find if you go from the bottom of the distribution to the top, this is the true joint distribution, what you find is almost 100% increase in the real wages that individuals have. And so there's a tremendous increase as you go from the bottom to the top, and so forth and so on. So this is just some of the measurement. I'll go through this. So what we've understood, and this is something that I think is very important, is that once we control for the cognitive and non-cognitive skills, a lot of these social problems that we typically are addressing, like the achievement gap between minorities and majority groups. These gaps are actually explained a large part by ability gaps. So here's the data from the late 1990s. If you look at the difference between whites and blacks in terms of who graduates high school, there's a 6 percentage point higher rate. This is now adjusting for some other factors. 6% higher rate, that's the raw data. If you adjust for ability, you actually find that the gap goes from a 6% gap favoring whites to a 14% gap favoring blacks. Okay, and the same thing is true for Hispanics. Looking at the college entry decision, let's just look at this is the college entry decision. What we see is a 12 percentage point gap between blacks going to college and whites, as opposed to, and a 14 percentage point for Hispanics. Once we adjust for the abilities that these kids have at the time they apply to college, that we see that the gaps actually turn negative, that it's more likely for minorities to be going to college. So ability is playing a huge role. So again, you could ask yourself, okay, ability plays a huge role, so what's going on? These gaps in abilities emerge at a very early age. Let me just show you one example. This is a case from a study that I'm doing with a developmental psychologist and economist at Irvine, Greg Duncan, where we're looking at kids who are measured. This is on a measure of cognition, where we can actually get measures starting at age 3. If you look at kids and mothers, so this is a benchmark measure. This line doesn't mean too much, but we have measures starting at age 3 and going to age 18. And we can see that basically this is this measure for kids coming from advantaged backgrounds. Now, if we look at same kids whose mothers have some college education, we see a substantial gap between those kids' scores and the kids whose mothers have these environments. And what's interesting and most important thing is that the gap at age 18 that's so important in determining college entry is mostly there, certainly by age 5, and it's even there in age 3. So before the school age has opened up, we actually are finding that these gaps are there. So if you look at high school children whose mothers are high school dropouts, we see huge gaps. These gaps are predicting who goes into college, who doesn't. And those gaps are there, and they're not much different. They don't change all that much as individuals go through school. So what you're saying is the schools aren't really accountable for expanding those gaps or for reducing those gaps. And that's important. And when you get the same thing for social behavior, I should probably move ahead, and for health, but I think I should probably in the instance. So the question, though, is what do we make of these things? Now, if Herrnstein was still alive and Murray is still alive, he were here, he would simply say, this is fine. This is exactly the argument they were saying. These gaps open up at a very early age. They're genetic, right? They start at early ages, the earliest age that we can really reliably measure a lot of these things, 2 or 3, and to make comparable comparisons. But then the question is, they'd say it's genetic. The question, though, is it genetic? Is it family environments? And what it has to go on? And here, I think, I want to show you that the evidence suggests a powerful role from the intervention studies for investments and things that, in other words, society can do something about in a constructive way. But let me just show you a staggering fact about American society, in case you haven't seen this before. If you ask what percentage of children under age 18 are living with a single parent, you find now in the year 2006, where this graph stops, it's about 28%, roughly. 28% is the figure. Starting in 1968, that figure was more like 13 to 12%. So we've had a huge run-up. And you can see that the major contributor to the growth trend between 1968 and the year 2006 is basically this category where the mother has never been married, and in some fundamental sense, and the father really hasn't been around, and to a significant degree. We have independent studies suggesting that most of these kids really haven't seen their father. The father's engagement's very, very limited. And the reason why this is important is that we actually can chart what the level of investment is in these children by family type. And there's a very set of detailed studies, and I'm glossing over these, but let me just give you some idea. If we look at measures of cognitive stimulation, we have longitudinal data sets where we follow children through their childhood. We can actually ask how much is invested into this child. So we look at measures of reading to the child, encouraging the child, and the like. If we look at the category of, say, just an intact family versus a family which is broken home or the single mother, you get substantial differences. Now, the scale here is somewhat arbitrary, and I'll show you in a minute that these differences map into real outcomes, real differences in achievement outcomes. But just to get at a level of the resource input, there's staggering differences. And it isn't all just the fact that these kids have access to fewer resources in terms of dollar resources. It's various dimensions of parenting that are actually at work as well. So what we can see is that there are substantial differences in family income across. So this is just an example of how unequal the resources are. This is an example in the, from a graduate student at the University of Chicago. And what he's looking at here is the amount of material goods, just toys, just regular toys, bicycles, various kinds of things that children 0 to 3 have available to them. And if we look at overall distribution in the population, what we'll see is if we put the Hispanic and black families in the white distribution, if they were full equality, this line would be flat across all categories, right? Just same, if blacks, you know, 10, so in the lowest deciles, what this graph is saying is that blacks are way overrepresented. So about, looks like almost 40% of all blacks are in the lowest decile of the white distribution. That's the level of disadvantage in terms of material resources. Hispanics the same way. If you look, for example, at cognitive stimulation, similar issue. So again, we see very great inequality in family environments starting early on, and emotional support. Now, how much of this is due to family income and parental education? Part of it, but by no means all of it. So for example, when we adjust for things like this, family income, you get rid of some of the gap, but much of it still remains. So there are substantial differences, and as I'll show you in a minute, this translates out. One thing I probably, since there aren't too many doctors in the audience and so forth, there is a biology that goes with this. And this is something that's very exciting. And this is where the case is not just based on test scores, not just based on the usual social science evidence, but it's based also on real genetic studies or understanding of how genes express themselves. Experience gets embodied in the biology of the organism. We've come to understand that in ways we never understood it before. Some of these developments are only 3 or 4 years old. It's very exciting. Some of the work in epigenetics is extremely exciting because it suggests how disadvantage can perpetuate itself over generations. So many of you, probably the older ones in the room, have studied years ago that the so-called Lamarckian evolution was simply wrong. But there's a version of it that's been revived under this form of modern epigenetics, where experience really does get under the skin. So let me just show you just a few pieces of how. This is a study taken, recently published 5 years ago now, so not so recent, but still. What you see is a study of what are called identical twins. Identical twins have been the laboratory for research in a lot of studies of social human behavior, behavioral genetics. And people say, I have 2 genetically identical twins, then basically I've sort of equalized their environments, at least their early environments, they were born to the same way. This shows you how. So this coloration here, without getting into the detail, is showing how the genes are methylated. Methylation is a process by which gene expression, the very gene expression that causes you to make proteins, that causes you to get sick or not get sick, that causes you, enables you to do a whole range of activities. If you look at these profiles, these are genetically identical. They're monozygotic twins. They come out of the same egg. They're literally the same genetic material. The fact that the shading here, even at age 3, is different means that already by age 3, the genetic expression is fundamentally altered. And it's altered in a way that stays with you for the rest of your life. If you look at the 50-year-olds, remember, these are people who are allegedly identical. So if you really thought that environment wasn't playing much of a role, a lot of it was genetics, the coloration should be identical, left and right. It's one twin versus the other. And instead, you see substantial differences. So the methylation is substantially different. We've learned that there are fundamental interactions between genes and environment. So without getting off too much on a tangent, we know, for example, that childhood maltreatment essentially can produce inflammation. Inflammation is a condition that's very harmful. Produces a number of, has a number of effects on disease and health throughout the lifetime. And so one of the factors that we've come to understand is, yes, maltreated children have more inflammation, okay? But what we've also come to understand is there's a genetic basis for this, that actually the effect of maltreatment is an interaction with other, with a particular genetic predisposition. And so this is the part that is new. This study by Francis Champagne is extraordinarily interesting. This isn't on people, by the way. It's on rats. So if you don't like rats, then tune out. But this is showing something very, very interesting. So methylation is this process where the experience gets under your skin. And so what she studies is the actual methylation of the genetic material. These are broods produced by rats. And the rat mothering behavior is differential in the sense that some rat mothers are very kind to their rat children, their rat pups, and they basically lick them and groom them. Those are nice rat mothers. And other rats are essentially not so nice. And it turns out there's a heritability component to it, and there are a lot of interesting things to say about these rats. But what I want to say here is that looking at studies where we actually say, what is the consequence of this licking and grooming behavior? You can literally see where the experience gets under the skin. You are literally changing the methylation pattern, which then triggers a whole set of behaviors. You ask, how well do these rats solve mazes? How well do these rats solve their problems that rats have and so forth? They don't do so well. So the low licking and grooming mothers are the ones producing dramatic methylation, and that persists into adulthood. So this early condition is leading to permanent conditions. And we have a lot of evidence where experience gets under the skin. So what this tells us is that the early years are playing a very important role in a way we didn't fully appreciate. Okay, so there's a lot more to say about that, and I will skip past it to say that there's some work on other organisms like rhesus monkeys. You can actually see dramatic differences where you really rear the children, the young rhesus monkeys with in very adverse situations, in this case peer rearing or surrogate rearing as opposed to maternal rearing, and you see substantial differences in terms of adult inflammation, lymphocyte activation, cell proliferation, and various other kinds of immune responses. And we can see, just to show you one dramatic difference, I don't know if you can see this slide, but if you look at 3 different conditions for the peer-reared monkeys, mother-reared, peer-reared, you're seeing that close to 23% of all the genes are differentially methylated by early experiences by the young monkeys. So there you can see. So these are animal control studies. The beautiful thing about animals is you can experiment on them, and you can see dramatic effects, and these effects persist. So early conditions are actually getting in the skin, affecting predispositions towards health, and affecting the structure of life. So this study by Moshe, Ziv, Meany, and Zlumi show essentially the peer rearing is differentially affecting methylation. And this study is done as recently as 8 months ago, and we still don't know exactly all the ramifications for disease and adult well-being. So what we've come to understand, I think this graph is not so good, so I should skip past it. But we've come to understand in a number of areas, this is work by Thompson and Nelson, we've come to understand that in various aspects of human development, there are critical and sensitive periods. That for certain acquisition of language without an accent, a foreign language, for vision, for seeing, for hearing, various periods seem to be more sensitive than other periods in terms of creating a predisposition towards beneficial performance or towards adverse performance. And so there really is a sense that early years are playing a role in ways that I don't think we appreciated even 15 years ago. So the real public policy issue, which I want to conclude with these discussions, is what can we do? We know the early years are important, but here's where I come in as an economist on these issues and say, okay, look, how costly is it? Early years matter. Early years matter a lot, but maybe we can remediate. The question is, it's not just that the early years matter, it's how costly is it to achieve the same level of performance if we decide to wait. So it turns out that there are a lot of sensitive issues about early interventions. Early interventions can sometimes, they lead to a certain sensitivity. We're intervening in early family life. Maybe we shouldn't do that. And from a purely economic point of view, if we're equally efficient to intervene at age 15 as it is at age 5 months, then for the same dollar cost, you should always do it at 15, right? It's always better to postpone. I mean, there's an interest rate, you can put the money in the bank, you can do more investment at age 15. But what runs counter to that is the dynamics of the skill formation process. We've come to understand that it's very difficult to undo some of the damage that is not done by making early family investments or not making family investments. And so the real public policy question is how critical, how costly is delay? So if we want to fight crime, we want to solve crime, how important is it for us to think about these things early on as opposed to later on? What do we know about that? And I'll give you a little bit of evidence. I don't know how much time I have. 10 minutes? Okay, fine. Okay, fine. Yeah, I definitely will. I can stop at any point here. But let me just show you some idea. I want to show you some evidence from a program that's received a lot of attention over the years. Many of you have heard about it. Obama, when he ran for office, was using data from this program. Many, many people. I'm sure in Ohio you hear a lot about the Perry Preschool program. It was conducted up in Ypsilanti, Michigan, some 40 years ago. It's a randomized trial. Kids were brought into this program. They were all disadvantaged kids. All of them had subnormal IQs. They were selected to have subnormal IQs. They all had IQs of 80. They were brought in to this. They were all from disadvantaged families. They were brought in, and they were given 2 years of an intervention. And the way the intervention worked was that they actually gave children what we would think of as social and emotional program of skills. It wasn't cramming facts into them. They weren't trying to create baby Einsteins or anything of the sort. What they were trying to do is get kids to stay on task, to do certain work, to essentially show perseverance. So the key word in the Perry study is plan, do, review. Kids make plans, they execute the plans, they review the plans, and they learn to get along with each other. And it's a program that lasts 2 years. Some kids randomly assigned to the treatment group, some to the control group, and then they were followed. And they're still being followed. They're close to 50 years of age, and proposal is under the way to essentially collect data on Perry at 50. But let me show you what the data did. So it's an amazing study that we actually intervene, and we intervene early on. We have a treatment and control group randomized trial. So the amazing thing about Perry, and this goes back to my point about understanding the structure of how these programs work, is it didn't raise IQ. Here is the way that Perry IQ worked. So these are the treatment group. They came in with a mean of 80. They came in at age 3 to 4. You get this big surge from 80 to 95. Miracle had happened. Then suddenly you got down to, by age 10, they were at 85. But still, what was the control group? Well, the control group started again around age, about IQ of 80. They had some, what economists, what statisticians call regression to the mean. They tended to, you sample somebody who has a low draw, they tend to go back to the median of the population. But at age 10, the treatment and control groups are basically the same. So it looks like it failed. And if you looked only at IQ, the program did fail. And that's what I'm saying earlier, that the structure of the way we think about success or failure, so much cognitively oriented, is completely misguided. And let me show you how. This is a study. I don't know if you can see this so well, but there are a lot of treatment effects that have been evaluated. And this is just for males. There's similar data. Big effects on crime, big effects on employment, big effects on monthly income. As I say, we follow these kids into their 40s. These kids were more adjustable to the treatment group kids compared to the control groups, were much better on many dimensions of welfare. What this graph does is it decomposes the treatment effect into how much of this was due to a boost in cognitive factors, how much of it was a boost due to non-cognitive factors. And of course, in any study, we don't measure everything, so that there is a big chunk which we don't measure. But we can ask how much of the total treatment effect we observe was due to these non-cognitive factors. So take a look at this one behavior, crime at age 40. Total charges of all crimes with victims up to age 40. And you can see that about 70% of the total treatment effect came by an enhancement of personal behavior. That's a code word in this particular study for meaning things like social skills, self-control, self-discipline. So the program worked. It had a very high economic rate of return, and it worked by shaping the motivation of the students. It also raised the achievement scores. So if you were giving No Child Left Behind tests to these kids, their IQs are no higher, but they're much more motivated. They actually are doing better on a standard achievement test. So that's the tip-off that we need to think more broadly. So maybe this is a good time to stop when you start putting mathematics out. Now, the claim is always you lose half the audience for each equation. I have a bunch of them. So maybe I should stop. But let me just talk about one. The idea is really the following. I just want to summarize with this. that we have capacities. And these capacities are things that have to do with cognition, they have to do with personality, and they have to do with health. So there's a framework here where we think of all of these lifetime outcomes as being created by these capacities, as well as the incentives to use the capacity. It's also incentives. I mean, police matter in crime, there's no question about it. But we also know that some of these personality traits dispose people to crime. So, now it's not cooperating. It's asking me to stop. Okay, yes. So the expression of capacities is this. And this is where I would conclude and show one last figure, and then I really will stop. Now, I'll skip past a bunch of slides. But here is the dynamics of the capability process, and this is where I really want to emphasize. So if we look at this capacity, it's a vector of capacities, a whole host of these factors. Capacities are self-productive. So skill begets skill. We've estimated these things econometrically. This is kind of a dynamic equation of motion, a nonlinear difference equation for those familiar with that language. In IT would be investment. This is what parenting, schools are all about. And this is just parental background, just like the presence of certain factors. But this IT would be more like investments, school reading to the child, the kind of figures I put up. And so what we've come to understand by estimating these equations is to understand how easy is it through this IT to make up for the lack of investment early on. So we can look at the degree of substitution. How well can later investments, in other words, remediation, make up for early bad conditions, which then untreated early problems? And so this is a graph which shows exactly the dynamics of skill formation, going from prenatal period down to adulthood, tracing out the dynamics. And I can go through all that, but let me just summarize some work with Cunha and myself and Suzanne Schanak. Flavio Cunha, myself, and Suzanne Schanak. And basically what we do is estimate these equations. We look at data, real data on this. And I'll skip all this because you don't want to see this. But let me just summarize the main finding. This is the main finding from this work. Self-productivity, how skill feeds into producing later skill. Those self-productivity effects are very strong. What we also can see, consistent with a lot of work in medicine, a lot of work in epidemiology, a lot of work in psychology, it's much more difficult to compensate for the effects of adverse environments, especially on cognitive skills in the adolescent years. So remediation programs in adolescence, like convict rehabilitation programs, job training programs, are typically much less effective. And this technology is consistent with that. And so let me skip all these figures and just conclude with this. So out of this, we can extract a body of lessons. We can ask the simple economic question. If we target programs towards the earliest years, precisely because of the dynamics of this skill formation process, and we ask, what's the economic rate of return? We get a very high economic rate of return in the period 0 to 3. If we go 4 to 5, we still find high returns. That was Perry. I actually didn't mention a whole body of other programs. As we go down, we find, so what's the hypothetical experiment? The hypothetical experiment is I have $1 now to invest. I have a child, I have a newly formed child. Where in the life of the child should I direct the first $1? The answer is, from an economic standpoint, where the marginal return is higher. And the marginal return is very high in the early years. Why is it high? Because the early skills, the early skill base, essentially promotes the productivity of later skill base. So for example, we know that if we invest in these kids early on, we can avoid all the problems of special education and discipline problems and the like that occur down school. We can avoid criminal justice and all of these other programs. So it's the fact of the dynamics of the human skill formation, the fact that organisms grow and they have a dynamics of their own. So that's the main message, that essentially what is economically efficient, of course, is also going to turn out to be socially just. So the typical argument that was made about investment in early childhood in the past was always we should help the disadvantaged. And that's a model that's a standard argument, but it's one that doesn't cut a lot of ice in a lot of quarters, especially in mean times. You can say, well, we can be nice when we're richer. I think what we really have to understand is these problems are interrelated. This is a very rare public policy that we're talking about. It's It's one of the few policies where you can actually solve a problem that has motivated by a social justice consideration, and at the same time realize that you're getting a very high economic return. You're making the American economy more competitive. You're actually supplying the firms with more skilled labor. You're also improving the life prospects of a lot of kids born into disadvantage. And we've seen that a lot of kids are being born into disadvantage. So that's what I think the economic case is, and I'm very grateful for your attention this hot day, beautiful day in case. Thank you.
Is this working or no? Hello? Can you hear me? Okay, so we only have about 10 or 15 minutes left. First, I'd like to acknowledge Professor Heckman. Thank you so much. We will have all of this presentation on our website. Not that you'll be able to explain all of these slides to your colleagues and friends, but hopefully having some time to ask some questions, seeing as we're here on campus, we want to do so. So we encourage you to please come forward. We have speakers here on either side, and I don't know that you need any moderating. I'm Gabriella Celeste. I'm here with the Child Policy Initiative here at Schubert, and I'm here to host moderating, but it may not be necessary at all. So please go ahead, sir.
Programs beside Perry, which is an outstanding program, like Auditorium or
Yes.
other programs?
You mind to talk about that, or?
I just wondered, does it replicate on your same findings?
These programs are different. I mean, I don't have time to really go through all these programs. I'm actually working with the Auditorium data as well. Those kids are actually now 30 years of age. Again, it was a randomized trial, this case conducted in North Carolina, Chapel Hill area, North Carolina. That program was a little different than Perry. Perry started at age 3 and 4. Auditorium starts at about 6 weeks, and Perry stopped at age 4, early 5s, and the Auditorium program, at least a part of it, went to age 8. And so what you have is a much more intensive program. There, you actually saw effects on IQ that lasted at least till age 21. Again, starting early enough, you actually saw bigger effects in terms of IQ. Not the zero effect that you saw in Perry. But they're comparable in many ways, with one exception, crime. The crime statistic in the Auditorium is suggesting there's no effect on reducing crime between treatments and controls. But recently we became aware that this may not hold because the way the questions were solicited, the crime data are self-reported in the Auditorium study, and they're from police records in the Perry study. Self-reporting crime is very inaccurate. Sorry.
The question I really have is these programs collect a huge amount of data. They
Yes.
have huge amounts of data.
Correct.
And are you seeing the same effects across these programs, I guess?
Yes, you mean comparing programs across programs,
Yes.
not within. Well, that's a project that I'm engaged in doing. Been a lot of studies, so-called meta-analyses that have been put out, people recycling the same old statistics and showing that generally there's an effect of these programs. There are a bunch of these programs, the IHD pre-program, Infant Health and Development Program, the Chicago Parent-Child Program, the Auditorium, Perry. Those 4 are some of the favorites that people recycle and recycle. And then there are some more recent programs that don't have the long-term follow-up. But what hasn't been done, and is being done now, is actually taking these programs and actually finding out who are the target populations. They turn out to be different populations. Perry was enrolled on the basis of child characteristics. Auditorium was enrolled on the basis of parent characteristics. The average IQs of kids in the Auditorium study are not 80, as you saw in that figure. In the Auditorium study, they're 93. And these are all African American kids. So you're actually seeing 13-point difference in IQ. That's because the enrollment criterion was based on parents, because the kids were only 6 weeks old, so a good measure of IQ is not so easily. Oh, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is one, but nonetheless, that at least at the time that people were doing this, they didn't think they had a good measure. So the answer still remains to be fully determined from a scientific point of view. You really want to be able to say, are the interventions comparable? Are the samples comparable? Are the questionnaires comparable? And we're in the middle of doing that. And we started with we started with the Perry study. We've reanalyzed it. We've reinterpreted the cost-benefit study. That graph I showed you showed most of its effects through non-cognitive skill. That went beyond just the speculation. It seems like the answer, but it's not like we have the same parameter across 4 different studies. We really need to understand to adjust for all those other factors.
And one other quick thing, the 2010 Head Start study, the randomized
The new
control.
study, yeah.
And the
Again,
Heritage
that wasn't the
Foundation.
but that wasn't a long-term follow-up study, like
No,
some
not
of these
yet.
other studies. And again, Head Start is a different animal altogether. Remember, actually this fade-out that you saw in Perry was found for Head Start back in the late 1960s. And that's why everybody said Head Start was a failure. But Head Start is not as enriched as some of these other programs. And as a result, I think you're going to find, typically, at least in the early days of Head Start, it was employer of last resort. They were employing the mothers of the children as well as the children. It wasn't the kind of enrichment that some of these other programs represent. And so I think in some sense the structure is not as strong. I mean, the program isn't as strong, the level of enrichment. There are some studies, subsets within Head Start which have shown some real effects, but it's much more heterogeneous a program.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh,
Okay, we'll move over here and then we'll come back and forth.
okay.
I was wondering how you feel your argument applies cross-culturally.
To what?
Cross-culturally? So in a different culture.
Well, no, one thing that staggered me, I was in Chile last summer, and I was amazed to find that 50% of all the Chilean kids were born out of wedlock. They had a lot of the same problems we see. In Taiwan, the level isn't as high, but it's growing in terms of out of wedlock births. If you look at the United Kingdom, you actually see a huge number of births out of wedlock, and you actually see the emergence of, sometimes not so graciously called skinheads or, the underclass or whatever you want to call it. But you see the same dropout phenomena. The OECD issued a report a few years ago documenting the growth in this group of people who don't complete secondary school, they're not integrated in society, they're not working. And that was true across many countries. Now, the level, in America we're lucky because we have very rich data about family environments. Only recently have the Irish, the Italians, the Germans started doing these Perry-like studies. They're actually doing more of them now than we are. Actually, in Chile, they're doing about 50 or 60 early childhood interventions, and a lot of different groups working down there. And in Colombia and many other countries. But there's an awareness that at least the contours of these problems are the same. The family, this is the big issue here. The family is under stress in a lot of these countries. And with it then, the quality of early life is under stress. So even though it's not identical, I think there are very similar patterns. I would guess if you could look at Eastern Europe, there's no good data, but if you were to look at for example, Russia or Poland or Romania, you would probably find very dramatic conditions deteriorating for the family life. Similar. So that's a general phenomenon which I think, if we think about what these programs are doing, they're addressing. And so in that sense, I think there is a cross-cultural basis. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Why don't we take your question, sir?
Hello. I just have two quick questions. The one question is related to personal finance. Try to apply your theory to child education. You mentioned that the return rate will be higher if you invest early
Yes.
in the childhood. And just for example, if I have some money put aside, for child education, should I put my 5-year-old to a private school to you spend the money to send the 5-year-old to private school rather than to save that money for his higher education?
Well, you got to be careful. Who are you when you're making this study? I mean, if you represent a middle-class parent who's investing actively in your child and supporting the child's schoolwork, then a lot of what I said today isn't so important because you're actually providing those investments. You're actually providing those environments. If you're talking about somebody who's very disadvantaged, where the child is not getting much cognitive stimulation, where the child's not read to as much, not given the same motivation, then for sure the investment should probably take place earlier. So part of it is really, remember what I'm talking about is not just the school. I'm talking about the whole environment that supports the school and supports the child. So it's the school, it's the family, and then the direct investment in the child. So I think you'd have to take it case by case about where the return would be highest. I have a graph which I skipped over, which shows that if you actually look at where you should target differentially, there are real differences. I mean, there are people who are, the very disadvantaged individuals who have very, very high returns, but it depends on exactly what the configuration of disadvantage is. How much of it is like a Down syndrome issue? How much of it is the early initial conditions of the child? How much of it is bad initial conditions for the parents? The parents of the child less educated, maybe less sophisticated in child rearing and so forth. So the structure really does depend a lot. I mean, so the broad category is the child should get a lot of stimulation early on. But a lot of middle-class families are doing that. Sometimes you see movies where the mother's smothering, so it can go the other way. Maybe there's two. Woody Allen made movies like that, if you remember. But so it's not all that the mother is completely silent. But in many, many families, it's not, the mother's role isn't there. So, and there's a portfolio. You see, that's the point. The graph that I showed you is a graph saying, where do you spend the first dollar? Now, any good economist would say, in the end, we want the marginal returns to be the same at all stages of the life cycle. And so what that says is that we should invest a lot early on and probably relatively less later on. And if we spend public money on job training versus early childhood, there's no contest that early childhood has a much higher rate of return. I did a lot of work on late job training programs. I mean, what's the rate? I said the rate of return to classroom size was negative. The rate of return to Job Corps is 0. I mean, Job Corps is a very big program. If you ask how well is the money spent on Job Corps, it is not well spent. A recent study done by the Labor Department showed that you get basically $3 more a year from a year and a half in Job Corps, which costs thousands of dollars, $30,000. You're getting no economic return from that. So if you were to say, what's that return against the 6 to 10% return for Perry, for example, there's no contest. So that's the way we should think about it. We should bring cost-benefit analysis back into public policy making. We should prioritize, and we should understand that, take those arguments to where we can and prioritize using this economic metric. But it's not going to be the one-size-fits-all.
I'm going to try and let someone else come in because we are almost out of time, and I'd like to at least get another question in here, please.
Okay, first, Dr. Heckman, I would like to thank you for your research. As an early childhood practitioner, I'm going, yay. You know, more money, more money. But what my question is, what do you think the implications are for institutions of higher learning that prepare teachers to support that early learning?
Well, there's a whole issue, which, I mean, there are a lot of, I skipped over a bunch of slides. This is called practical issues. You're raising one of them. And practical issues would include things like, I mean, recognizing that all early childhood investment is not alike. I mean, really, you can have these programs that are called childhood. We had one such program that our former governor, Blagojevich in Illinois, instituted, and it was a diluted effort, very small sums, and there's little evidence that programs that are operating at a very low quality level are having much of an effect. In fact, some evidence they may be harmful, right? I mean, if we have low quality childcare, we decide to just kind of, some people say, oh, it's better to have a first stab, get our foot in the door and then we'll build. That's not a good idea. There are a lot of studies done suggesting very low quality childcare can have harmful effects, especially on kids with certain predispositions. So the answer is that we have to really go into this in an aggressive way and recognize right now we're spending, what, $7,000 to $9,000 per year on a typical student in an ordinary K through 12. Spending comparable sums on early childhood is not going to be out of line, not inappropriate. But what that means is you're going to have to educate a lot more and train a lot more of these people at a high quality level. I don't think you want the kind of traditional Head Start, basically where they were parents who were filling in as volunteers. Some of these successful programs like Perry, Educare, it looks like they'll be successful. Obviously, Darien had professionals, trained professionals. So these are people typically with BAs, sometimes with MAs, even I think in Perry, PhDs in education. So you're dealing with very skilled people. And so there is a sense in which that's costly. But the return pays off. Those costs were included in that calculation. So it's not saying that you get it back, but it is also saying that you can't do it on the cheap. Okay, so I would say the implication would be there should be a greater emphasis. But if you look at the salaries now for a lot of these people working in early childhood centers, they're very low. They're not competing with what the other occupations are, not even competing with teachers, ordinary teachers' salaries. And if we think about that, we think, well, we may be shortchanging ourselves in the future. So that's part of the act of real public discourse that should occur, that we understand how we create the architecture of a successful system. And there are a lot of details still to be worked out in this practical issue section. If you want, I can talk for another 20 minutes, but I'm just threatening. I'm not going to do it.